think there's a lot of ad-libbing in the administration, and you have people like Steve Witkoff, who's going to Moscow and spending hours with Putin and coming out and repeating Russian lines.
Tell me, what is your take, Yaroslav, on the meeting that's been taking place here at the military base Northwood in the county of Hertfordshire, looking at this coalition, which is there. It's the fine details are being worked out now about how it would deploy into Ukraine if there's a ceasefire. What's the view of what's going on there? Well, from the other side of the Atlantic in America, first of all, because a lot of planning going on, but no clear idea of what it's going to end up doing, if anything.
Right. So there are lots of hypotheticals. I mean, this force, if it ever comes together, would be deployed only if there is a deal between Ukraine and Russia that the U.S. is trying to broker. So far, there's been a lot of hurdles. Ukraine has accepted the idea of a 30-day ceasefire. Russia has not. It has put forward a lot of preconditions in President Putin's conversation with President Trump. And these preconditions included not just the stop of the mobilization of the Ukrainian military and the rearmament of Ukraine, but also they were very clear that they oppose any presence of foreign troops in Ukraine.
Yes.
And so that's been the policy of Russia since this conflict began, because obviously they are still interested in the original goal, which is taking over all of Ukraine, and any presence of NATO forces there will be an obstacle to that.
Right. Go on. So carry on, Yaroslav.
Yeah, coming to the meeting today of the European military chiefs, I think the best thing about this is we don't know exactly what they're discussing, because for far too long, there's been a lot of telegraphing and leaks and telling the Russians everything's going to happen. So now European governments are very, very serious. Many of them, especially those closer to Russia, see the events unfolding now as existential for their own security and possibly even their own survival as independent countries. I'm talking about Poland, talking about the Baltic states. And so everyone is playing with the cards really, really close to their chest. The big question, of course, is what role the U.S. would eventually play if this force deploys. And President Trump has been very clear that he doesn't intend to provide any security guarantees to this force. So yes, the Europeans are calculating what can do on their own.
So there's this kind of test of well, it's not even a test of will. It's an exercise in applying pressure, moral pressure on Donald Trump to give some sort of promise that if there's a ceasefire and those forces go in, America will be there if they're needed. Not with boots on the ground, but just as all those various countries' troops go in. If there's a Russian new attack, then America would at least provide something like intelligence support, or maybe aerial surveillance, or maybe air cover. So far, as you say, Donald Trump, Yaroslav, has shown no sign to move in that direction. In your judgment, is that immovable? Is there any possibility in your judgment of Donald Trump changing that position and offering that kind of American security guarantee? Because, on this side of the Atlantic, they're counting on it.
Yeah, it's really hard to predict what Donald Trump will do, but I think the big question we have to ask ourselves is whether his priority is ending the war in Ukraine, or is his priority opening up this new era of cooperation with Russia in the Middle East, in other parts of the world, and in Europe. In which case, he is likely to accept pretty much everything that President Putin wants to, and President Putin does not want this force.
Yeah, well, that's a discouraging view, but I think it's an analysis that so many of us would absolutely share. Where is Donald Trump's real agenda? Where does he see this leading? Rachel?
What fascinates me is, at the moment, Donald Trump seems to be willing to give Putin an absolute veto on what kind of troops are going to be allowed to go in to keep or maintain any kind of peace or reassurance, as they're now calling this force, rather than a peacekeeping force. Yaroslav, to what extent do you think that is open to change and challenge? It's in the end, it's a power struggle, isn't it? And is Trump going to ultimately feel that Putin's humiliating him and taking him for a fool, which is what seems to be happening?
Well, what's really interesting is watching how Trump has been, and his senior advisors have been repeating almost verbatim Russian talking points that have no bearing to reality. There was this information that came from the Kremlin about thousands of Ukrainian troops allegedly surrounded by the Russians in the Kursk region, And President Trump twice spoke about it, saying, that President Putin promised me very kindly to spare their lives. And no such encirclement exists in reality. And I'm sure U.S. intelligence agencies know about this really, really well. And yet President Trump chose to repeat what, he had heard from President Putin. So, yes, I mean, Russia has not really ceded anything so far. And it's sticking to its guns. I mean, what Russia wants is what it wanted all along, which is, a government in Kiev that will be under its control.
Yeah, I mean, Joe and Rachel, on this question that Rachel points out, that at the moment it looks as if Putin's been given the power of veto over this force doing almost anything. They're a coalition with a will, but not a way to do anything, while Putin stands in their way. And it's illogical that should continue in this way. It cannot be allowed to continue in this way. But what do you do about it? That's the massive question. And I guess today, especially, we've been starting to hear the signals from some of those European leaders that, look, they are in principle ready to go in, whether Putin likes it or not, that he would not have that veto. But it is contingent on that American support. And if Trump doesn't move, then you get the ultimate question. Well, then what? Do you go in, despite that sort of, call it obstruction if you like, but certainly denial of help from Trump, and in the face of that warning from Putin, calling his bluff? That's going to be the ultimate decision, isn't it?
Well, and actually, Putin hasn't agreed to any kind of ceasefire. So, there's multiple blocks to this at the moment. And without Trump really challenging Putin and standing up to him, it's hard to see how it really moves on, because at the moment, Putin's, he's saying yes, 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 but, and all the buts are much bigger than the yeses.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of interesting thing that Trump's kind of riding two horses, because he wants Europe to step up. But then at the same time, Europe are then stepping up because they're having the conversations. But then Putin is saying, well, no. So then it kind of looks daft that Trump was saying that Europe had to step up in the first place, because he's kind of trying to make people do something in one area which was never going to get through potentially, which then makes you think, well, hang on, which seat were you in and which conversation were you privy to that then you've started this work for nothing, potentially? But also, it does sort of feel a bit like an apples and pears kind of conversation, because it feels like nobody's really on the same page, because you've got four main players, really, if you consider that you've got Europe, Zelensky, Putin and Trump. And yet there isn't really one conversation that they're all taking part in. They're having side conversations. They're having a discussion about actions, but none of this is joined up because Putin isn't actually at the table. He's just lobbing literally grenades as well. There's still a physical war going on, but he's sort of lobbing these essentially these kind of, this is my line, this is my line, this is what I won't accept. And Trump's not doing a great deal at the moment. So I can't quite tell whether Trump's just letting this play out and then we'll sort of make a major intervention. Yeah. But there is this problem that Trump's line has always been, well, if I've got a financial interest there, then that's enough to stop everyone from misbehaving. Well, they can't even have one decent conversation where everyone's in the same place at the moment. I'm not sure that it's reassuring that just because he's got an interest in minerals that everyone's going to play ball. So
well, minerals and apparently power stations.
And now power stations, exactly.
And Yaroslav, it does seem, doesn't it, that the president is all over the place on this. I mean, we know that Donald Trump and the administration have been saying, look, give us a massive stake in Ukrainian mineral rights, and then that will give you some sort of guarantee, because Putin won't want to march over territory where the United States corporations are digging for minerals. Well, it didn't cut too much ice with the Ukraine's allies. And now yesterday we get this additional idea, Yaroslav, where he's saying, well, just what about if America takes control of power stations, including the Zaporizhia power station, which is not functioning, and it's in Russian hands, which seems no more persuasive. I mean, Zelensky today is saying, look, Zaporizhia doesn't work. The rest of the power stations are Ukrainian, and they're not up for grabs. As I say, all over the place. What you're left with is the idea, I suppose, Yaroslav, that we're looking at Donald Trump, looking at Putin, and the two of them, like the strongmen leaders, wanted to carve up Ukraine between them. Some would put it, brutally, like gangsters at a negotiating table, wanting to take their slice of the action. And that interpretation, is that your interpretation, Yaroslav? Because it is the interpretation of a lot of commentators in America, although it's obviously a divisive subject.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of ad-libbing in the administration, and you have people like Steve Witkoff, who's going to Moscow and spending hours with Putin and coming out and repeating Russian lines. You have others like Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, who are speaking in more cautious tones, but also about Russian intentions. Certainly don't say that they trust Putin. But I think the question really is, about the carving up. Is it about the carving up of just Ukraine, or is it a bigger plan to carve up Europe between Russia and the U.S.? Because what the Kremlin read out of this conversation said that we need to go back and discuss the causes of this war. And if you remember, in 2021, there was a meeting between the U.S. and Russia in which Russia said that Ukraine is just the first step, and we need to roll back NATO, roll back American presence to where it was at the end of the Cold War. So basically restore the Russian sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, countries that are now in the European Union and NATO. And that remains Russia's strategic goal. And the question is, will President Trump be okay with that? And a lot of Europeans are wondering now. They're no longer certain that he's not okay with that.
Well, if Donald Trump isn't moving and Putin is continuing with his saber rattling and threats, then in a sense the ball is in Europe's court and in the court of Ukraine's friends. Well, what do they do about this coalition? Do they sit there waiting for Putin to say it's okay to go in? Do they wait for Putin to be defeated? That looks like a very long wait. Or are we talking about forces going into Ukraine even without that backup by Trump, even despite the threats from Putin? Not necessarily marching to the front line and joining in the battle, but countries including our own, including Britain, have talked about putting troops into Ukraine in recent weeks to help out with training and maybe a bigger effort on those lines, calling Putin's bluff, giving Ukraine the kind of support that might tip the balance. Is that realistic? Is that not just the logic of where we need to go?
Well, and I mean, there's still the concern about Estonia and other places where there have been deployments and how close they are to Russia. But I can't help but wonder if this is sort of Ukraine Riviera, like Mark II for Trump, and that actually this is part of is he actually envisaging a sort of power play for some land that is then going to become a sort of these investment sites for the US, and it's the minerals, then it's the power plant, and does he then end up with some sort of, almost like his Mar-a-Lago? Is he sort of developing some sort of mini American state within this area, and he sort of becomes the...
Well, certainly seizing assets.
Well, exactly.
Asset stripping, if you like.
It does. I mean, it does feel like it doesn't feel like a quest for peace. It just feels like a business deal. But it feels like a business deal where not everyone's sure which bit's for sale and which bit's of any use to anybody, and also how the deal will be done. And it feels like there's a real sense of almost, it feels irrational. There's a lot about this that doesn't make sense. But to Trump, it's clear that in his mind, his lines are very clear, as are Putin's. Putin's are, I don't want troops there. And Trump's are, well, it's fine if we've got a presence because we've done deals. It all stays calm, it all stays peaceful. And in their own minds, they seem to think that's perfectly reasonable. And of course, the rest of Europe is saying, hang on, this is on our doorstep. We don't like it.
So Yaroslav, before you leave us, and thanks for joining us, there'll be more talks, won't there, at the weekend? What do you anticipate is going to be discussed there? What might come out of it?
Well, I mean, there will be talks between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine in the Middle East, and they will be hashing out the details, first of all, of this partial ceasefire, they stopped the attacks on energy targets in both directions, and then possibly a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, which actually sort of has been in place already for a while. Ukraine's main port, Odessa, has been operating at record capacity for more than a year now. And then maybe there will be steps towards something else. But at the same time, as you said, there is this planning in Europe by European military chiefs. And let's not lose sight of just how historic this is. This is the first time in 80 years that European military commanders are sitting together without the Americans on how to defend their own continent. And they may be talking about, this particular coalition of the willing peacekeeping force in Ukraine, but it's really about how these militaries could work together in a framework that is other than a US-led NATO.